Okay, everybody, we are going to get started. Okay, put this chat down here. Okay, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Mary Carson Stiff, and I work for Wetlands Watch. Seated here with me is John Harbin, who's with the Living River Trust, and then behind us, or to the side of us with the dog, is Skip Stiles, Executive Director. Thank you for being on the call. I just want to start with a little bit of housekeeping and meeting format. So everyone is muted currently. We will unmute you during the question and answer portion of the webinar, which will happen after we talk about our project. As I said at the very beginning, if you'd like to turn on your video, feel free to do so. This is a collaborative project, and we encourage everyone to get to know one another and each other's faces as well. While we're speaking, we will turn off our video just for the purpose of reading notes and making sure we know what screen is showing for confusion reasons. And so if you have questions while we're speaking and going over the materials, please use the group chat function. You can chat directly to us, the presenters, or you can chat to everyone. It doesn't matter which little toggle option you choose. Please ask your questions there, or write your questions down, and then we can you can ask them during the Q&A time. So let's see, without further ado, I want to introduce our team. Hold on one second. Okay, great. And I'm going to turn off my video. We're still here, don't worry. Okay. So our project team, as I said, I'm Mary Carson Stiff. I'm the Director of Policy at Wetlands Watch, and I specialize in the National Flood Insurance Program and Sea Level Rise Adaptation Planning and Policy. I'm a certified floodplain manager, board member of the Virginia Land Conservation Foundation, the Floodplain Managers Association in the state, and Living River Trust, which is the organization that is our partner in this work. Before joining the Wetlands Watch team, I worked for the Land Trust Alliance, Virginia Outdoors Foundation, and the Virginia Coastal Policy Center at William & Mary Law School, where I obtained a JD in 2013, and I did my undergraduate at Bates College in Maine. Skip Stiles, who waved from the side, and he's over there taking notes, is Executive Director of Wetlands Watch. He's working at the front lines of sea level rise adaptation at the local level for over 10 years. He was an independent consultant on issues related to science, the environment, and public policy for many clients, including the White House Office of Science Policy, the Rockefeller Foundation, Pew, and the National Academy of Sciences. And before that, he served over 22 years in Congress in a variety of senior staff positions. He was on the Virginia Climate Change Commission in 2018 under Senator Kane, and is a board member of the Virginia Conservation Network. He is a graduate of William & Mary. John Harbin is the first administrator of the Living River Trust, a local land trust in Sediment. Is a formal principal planner for the city of Chesapeake, Virginia, and he is a native of our region and has worked in a variety of capacities in the environmental field, including consulting, government, and other nonprofit organizations, as well as the Virginia Outdoors Foundation, which is important to note given this work. He has a Master's of Urban and Environmental Planning from the University of Virginia and a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Policy from Virginia Tech. He is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners. So that's our team, and we are very excited that you're participating in this exciting work, and we really appreciate your interest. Wetlands Watch is the project lead for this work that we're doing. We are a statewide organization, and we operate pretty similarly to a think tank, working to protect wetlands and doing so primarily through sea level rise adaptation planning and implementation. We work at the local, state, and federal levels to build programs and policies that help local governments adapt to sea level rise. Local governments are the real change makers in the fight to adapt to climate change, and that's where we like to do most of our work. John's going to speak a little bit about the Living River Trust since I just introduced our organization. So take it away, John.
Great. Thank you, MC. So again, my name is John Harbin. I'm the administrator of the Living River Trust. The trust was founded in 2003 in response to the APM terminal's port complex over in Portsmouth. The trust was part of the mitigation for that project, in which we cleaned up an area of Chesapeake called Money Point. So through that, we established a bottomlands impact mitigation program. And in around 2010, the trust adopted a land conservation program, which is sort of the focus of our efforts now. So as a land trust, we hold conservation easements like most other land trusts. We own land in fee, and we work to facilitate conservation projects such as this one throughout Southampton Roads. Where we work in Southampton Roads is, as you probably know, is a largely urban environment. We are a population of 1.7 million or more in the greater Hampton Roads region. So we are focused on kind of the urban aspects of land conservation, and we accept small parcels of land anywhere from half an acre up to 15 to 20 acres, filling that kind of niche in between the larger existing organizations like Virginia Outdoors Foundation. We also go after really high value places that we would like to see conserved. Since 2010, when we really adopted the land conservation mission, we've preserved 622 acres throughout the Elizabeth River watershed, which is where we do most of our work. And with that, I will let MC continue on.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. So for those of you who are on the webinar from elsewhere in the US, this is where we're working. This is where our project is taking place in southeastern Virginia, which is called Hampton Roads, or the 757. We'll be calling it Hampton Roads, but that's where we are. We're beach adjacent and tidal and wet, as I will kind of describe very briefly. So zooming into where we're working specifically, we're working with two different municipalities, City of Norfolk and City of Chesapeake. City of Norfolk's very urban, 99% built out essentially, and the City of Chesapeake is far more suburban and quite large in area. City of Chesapeake, as you can see, is very, very significant in size and includes a lot of different natural resources that are essential to our region, including the Great Dismal Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and then some natural area preserves as well. The City of Norfolk is the other community where we're working, and as you can see, there are far more natural features here. We are home to the largest naval station in the world, Naval Station Norfolk, as well as significant port terminals and other military bases. So, sea level rise is the name of the game in our region. It's our greatest climate change risk that we face. We are extremely vulnerable. We have the highest rate of sea level rise on the East Coast. We are dealing with subsidence, sea level rise increase, as well as statistically measured increases in rainfall intensity. We are dealing with significant issues with undersized stormwater systems across all of our region, and have been looking at developing higher standards for stormwater management purposes as communities deal with the increase of rainfall as a result of climate change. This is a graph that shows our sea level rise scenarios. This section here is the observed, is the observed historic sea level rise, and then the lines moving up in varying colors show our projections. Our region is kind of in a time of sea change, no pun intended, where we're dealing with local governments who have different scenarios that they're using to plan for sea level rise in the immediate and then in the future context. And so our regional planning commission is a body that convenes local staff and decision makers through various committees. They've decided that we should adopt, and our communities have unanimously agreed, a regional planning standard from which communities are not required to plan from, but it's a nice standard from which communities can have a regionalized standard to help with consistency across local government planning. So what we've decided is basically sticking with the NOAA intermediate high curve for 2017 is probably most aligned with these planning scenarios. So this is just an idea of what kind of increases we're looking at here in Hampton Roads. And this is specifically using Sewell's Point tide gauge, which is in Norfolk. So if you apply the 3 feet of sea level rise, which is the regional 2070 scenario, onto our subject area, you can see what this looks like, what the inundation will look like during our higher high water events. And this is from pulling from NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer, which is a great resource if those of you who aren't familiar with it. So looking at our communities, Norfolk and Chesapeake, you can see the level of inundation. Notably, we have flooding coming from the upper parts of the Chesapeake Bay that are really impacting the city of Norfolk, and as you move down south to the city of Chesapeake, you can see quite a significant level of inundation coming from the Albemarle Pamlico Sounds. The Outer Banks of North Carolina are right here. Chesapeake does in fact border North Carolina, and so you'll see future sea level rise projections really exacerbated by this southern watershed. So our problems are very significant. We estimate that to deal with the impacts of sea level rise and increased rainfall from climate change, our region has about $40 billion of mitigation needs on private property alone. Our current mitigation funding landscape is bleak, and our methods are not working. Local governments and individuals are relying on FEMA hazard mitigation grant funds, and the state has not historically invested in adaptation or mitigation. We have a coastal resiliency fund that has no money currently, with some to come, that's dependent on the regional greenhouse gas exchange. But essentially the programs that we do have and we are utilizing have a lot of legal, environmental justice issues and really don't work long term from an economic viability standpoint, as well as a social and local government functioning standpoint. Our region is heavily focused on home elevations, with a couple of outlier localities opting more for acquisitions, but all of our communities in the region are starting to shift to acquisitions, or at least to talk about acquisitions, which is great for our organizational mission at Wetlands Watch, but is also helpful because the cost of home elevations is really astronomical in our area. The investment, of course, is an economic necessity, but is ultimately a Band-Aid solutions. Local governments are on the hook for providing the services to structures that turn into islands during flood events, just like the home is being elevated that you see on your screen. So our pilot projects are looking at buyouts as an alternative and as a real solution, or long-term better solution to a lot of our mitigation needs, focusing on how to turn abandoned residential properties into something positive for property owners, local governments, and the community. So we're trying to reclaim high flood risk residential land and turning it back to what it was before, while offering property owners who are literally and fiscally underwater an opportunity to remove themselves from risk when they otherwise can't or couldn't, because their homes aren't selling, because either everybody knows it floods, like the area where this picture is taken in Norfolk, or because their flood insurance is too high and nobody wants to buy the house. So we want the benefit to, the financial benefit to go to property owners for turning their properties into some sort of conservation, and also helping remove future development in that area in the future. So we're talking about protecting people and local governments from building in risky places. Well, there will be zero long-term return on the investment. So Our project, we're kind of referring to this as Land Conservation Meeting Managed Retreat. Wetlands Watch is leading the project, but we are in direct partnership with the Living River Trust, the local land trust, and we are pioneering 2 different pilot programs with the cities of Chesapeake and Norfolk. Our goals are stated on the slide. We want to build resilience to sea level rise through conservation. We want to seek and bring new resources and approaches to adaptation and inform state and federal policy and private sector practices on the use of transitional urban parcels and we want to formalize the concept of a rolling easement on coastal property. And the goal is to really create national models that are replicable in other coastal communities that are dealing with all of the same issues that we're dealing with here in Hampton Roads. These are cultural issues, they're economic issues, and they're local government issues as well. So how are we doing this? We're trying to convert frequently flooded residential parcels to some form of open space, and wherever possible, restoring natural features and providing mitigation of flooding through what we're calling adaptive land management strategies. Our pilot projects are working within existing programs that are already on the ground in the local communities. The programs are in the city of Chesapeake, their acquisition and open space program, and this is funded through FEMA hazard mitigation grants. And then in the city of Norfolk, a resilient zoning ordinance that's new to the city that is disincentivizing development in areas of current and future flood risk by offering these resilience points for removing development rights in a high-risk flood area in the city. I'm going to provide a lot more detail on these 2 programs, but we're working within these existing guidelines, which I think is really helpful for a program like ours, which is new and innovative and hasn't been done anywhere, which is part of the challenge. The pilot projects that are coming out of this work are, there are 2 of them, and the first is the city of Chesapeake example, to do a feasibility study of how property can transfer from the city to the land trust when the properties are encumbered by FEMA acquisition deed restrictions. And in the city of Norfolk, an assessment of how to incentivize and actually implement this program that rewards or allows development through the extinguishment of development rights. And we want to do this specifically through the use of rolling easements. Okay, so while you all are engaged and on the line, we are working alongside experts. We are experts in our own right on certain issues, specifically sea level rise adaptation, but we are not experts in land conservation, tax incentive programs, and a lot more. And so we are really grateful for the participation and interest of so many professionals like you all to really try to vet our work and ensure that we're creating policies and programs that are exportable to other communities. This is what our project really looks like. It's a multi-year effort, and we are currently in year 1. So I've been working on building this national network of thought leaders like yourselves, and we're going to create working groups and tackle specific issues. In year 2, the Wetlands Watch Living River Trust team is going to develop strawman programs and policies to actually do the pilot work. And we'll be hosting what we're calling a working symposium in Hampton Roads that will include professionals that are engaged in this effort, like you all, to to receive the draft programs and policies and plans that we've created, and to provide feedback and help to make sure that these deliverables are actually usable to the communities like that you're working in. And then in year 3, we're going to incorporate all that wonderful feedback and then release the plans and policies to the public, and then look at how exportability works. Some of the programs and the policies that we're developing may not work perfectly in other states, and we're acutely aware of that. And so we want to be sure that we understand where the tweaks are and need to be to make sure that they can work elsewhere. I'm going to note that we're creating these work groups and working groups, and as we go through the projects and talk about some of the details, the blue box, like it's popping up on your screen right now, will pop up indicating where specific issues will be discussed in a separate working group. So this is to kind of alert you that if you're interested in learning more about a specific topic or a problem or issue that comes up on the screen, there'll be an opportunity for you to do so in the working group scenario. Okay, so John is going to talk about the City of Chesapeake project. So take it away, John.
All right, great. Thank you, MC. So the City of Chesapeake project is addressing neighborhood flood risk, which has been identified here on the map in the yellow areas. These are some of the most vulnerable neighborhoods of the city. They're located on the southern branch of the Elizabeth River. And we are working really in one of these neighborhoods, kind of right between Interstate 64 and Dominion Boulevard, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. So the background on this project, Chesapeake has a existing, very successful FEMA hazard mitigation grant acquisition program that they've administered for several years now and acquired at least 36 open space lots throughout the city in some of the most vulnerable neighborhoods that were shown on the previous slide. Under this grant, the FEMA grant, structures must be removed from the property, so any house or shed or other structure. The residents move elsewhere, and then the lot is left in open space via a deed restriction, and the city must report on a certain number of year basis to FEMA to ensure that those deed restrictions are being followed. So about a year or two ago, the city approached the Living River Trust about transferring these parcels from the city to the trust, really to address the cost that the city was incurring to maintain these lots. The city, now that the structures have been removed, they simply plant grass and they are left with mowing the parcels frequently. It's estimated about $2,400 per parcel per year, which equates to about $85,000 annual mowing costs. So the trust was interested because we thought, well, hey, we could maybe do something with these parcels that's a little bit more beneficial than just mowing the grass. So the city proposed kind of a pilot program and 5 particular parcels that happen to be adjacent to one another and next to a creek as kind of a pilot parcels to go through this process. And so the overall goal is to determine if a land trust, such as the Living River Trust, could and should accept land acquired through the FEMA acquisition program. And with that, I will show you kind of those 5 pilot parcels. They are located in what's known as the Mains Creek neighborhood of Chesapeake. You can see Mains Creek there kind of on the left side of the map. You've got the 5 lots here that are across or back up to the creek here. You can see the structures have been removed from lots 1 through 4. Lot 5 has also been cleared so that this image is just a bit dated. So that's kind of the zoomed in view of the parcels. Going out from there, you can see that the parcels are part of the Mains Creek tributary to the southern branch. There's already an existing wetland mitigation bank that the trust actually holds the easement over for. And so we really are interested in this area because there's kind of an existing pattern of restoration that's been going on along Mains Creek, and we think these are kind of key properties where we could build off that. So going into the project to do, the first and kind of foremost task is to gain FEMA's approval of this transfer, and VDEMS, which is the Virginia Department of Emergency Management. Under federal code and the deed restrictions, land trusts are able to hold land that's been acquired through the FEMA acquisition program. However, this has not been done to date that we're aware of, at least not holding outright in fee. There is an example of another quasi-state organization known as the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board that holds an easement over FEMA acquired property, but they don't own it outright. And so we have to kind of run this up the ladder and gain the necessary approvals and buy-offs to see and make sure that FEMA is on board with this. From there, we need to address the concerns of the city, the concerns of the trust, FEMA, and then obviously the neighborhood in which this is taking place. We need to make sure that everyone is on board and feels like this is a good idea. From there, we need to look at the permitted uses of the parcels. Is restoration allowed? But what other benefits could be derived from these kinds of projects? What other kinds of uses could we put these properties to? And that's where we really get into the adaptive land management strategies. We want to look into what is possible on these parcels that can derive various benefits, regulatory benefits like flood and stormwater retention, credit benefits through the TMDL program, MS4, CRS, or even wetland mitigation credits. Neighborhood benefits. We want to make sure that whatever we do on these properties is going to be of acceptance and benefit to the neighborhood. And then academic benefits. We want to see if these can be test beds for shoreline migration moving forward. So each of these kinds of to-dos are one of the work groups that Mary Carson mentioned, the first being the FEMA acquisition program work group. So they're going to tackle that first bullet, which is gaining FEMA and actually VDEM's approval of this transfer. The second work group is the community engagement work group, and that's going to be working with the residents and the city and the trust to gain their buy-in for this sort of work. And the third work group is the land management, adaptive land management strategies working group. They're going to be focused on running through each of the possible uses and figuring out what's permissible from a legal perspective, from a zoning perspective, to FEMA and VDEM and the city and the neighborhood. All right. And so the main project deliverables for the Chesapeake program are first being a deed restriction template for acquisition parcels so that this can be used elsewhere. This is really the document that allows the city to transfer ownership of the properties from the city itself to a land trust. And that has to be approved by Virginia Department of Emergency Management and FEMA. So that's part of that working group's kind of deliverable. The next is a adaptive management strategies list. So that's putting together a list of uses on these parcels that can be implemented moving forward. And then the last being a property transfer plan. And that's kind of a step-by-step list on how other land trusts throughout the country can go about acquiring FEMA purchased properties from other cities and counties that have similar programs in place. And with that, I think I will turn it back over to Mary Carson.
Okay, great. Thanks, John. So that was our first pilot in the city of Chesapeake, and that was living and existing in FEMA land. And so now remove yourself from all of the pain and suffering of thinking about this in a FEMA context and move into the city of Norfolk with us as we talk about a zoning ordinance and a program that the city has developed to incentivize the removal of flood risk and protection of people from that risk. So this is a great graphic that shows the increase of hours per year that streets have flooded in a specific neighborhood in Norfolk. This neighborhood is appropriately called The Hague, and it's one of our most vulnerable parts of the city. This work is done by some professors at Old Dominion University who have been studying increased in rainy day as well as sunny day flooding. So this is obvious that we have a serious problem. Now, what does this problem really translate and look like in our community? And this is really what it looks like. So we have a serious issue here in Norfolk. And we, of course, are seeing property losses, not just from home flooding, but also from vehicular flooding. And we have, you know, instead of snow days here, we have flood school days. And so we really want to protect those people who are most vulnerable, including our children, from this pretty scary hazard. So I want to talk about the city of Norfolk and their attention to the problem of flooding and sea level rise in the community. The city has been very forward-thinking, adopting a plan that is a 100-year plan, which is very atypical. Communities often will adopt 5-year comprehensive plans, and the city of Norfolk took that to the extreme and has adopted what is called the Vision 2100 plan. You can Google it, City of Norfolk Vision 2100. I would encourage you to do so. It's really interesting. One thing that came out of this plan is this graphic that you see before you. This is a image of Norfolk's neighborhoods and its infrastructure. And I just wanted for you to pay attention to the yellow color that's on the map. These are the areas of highest flood risk where the city is not planning on protecting with great infrastructure. So natural infrastructure will be the name of the game here, which is exactly in concert with what we're trying to do with this pilot project. These areas are also very, very close to the major waterways in the city. If you can't really tell from the map, the blue is very light, but that of course is all of our water features. And this flood risk follows historic creek beds that were filled during the development of the city over the past 200 years. If you overlay historic creek bed maps with the flood zone, the maps are nearly identical. So we've done a real nice job of filling in all of our natural resources, and so we're going to try to do what we can to help these natural features come back. So think about the yellow zones as we're talking about this project. So to provide some background and context, the city's new zoning ordinance is very innovative, and I would encourage you to check it out. The city split up, the city planners split up the city area into two different sections. So the two sections are, one, an area of low elevation, high flood risk, and two, areas of high elevation, low flood risk. And so this highest flood risk area is kind of created using FEMA flood maps, and it includes the 100-year and 500-year floodplains. So floodplains of the present and floodplains of the future. So it's important to kind of know that, because the city is thinking about development in the context of where it wants to see future development and encourage future development to go, because it has a much longer lifespan, and where they're trying to encourage people to devote resources away from, which is the low elevation, high flood risk area. So within the zoning ordinance, there's this really cool program called the Resilient Quotient Program. It's basically a point system, and it's an option for developers to meet citywide resilience standards. So anytime anybody wants to develop, or most importantly to Norfolk, redevelop anywhere in the city, they have to meet these resilient standards, and they can do that through opting into the Resilient Quotient Program. So in this Resilient Quotient Program, there is the option for developers to earn resilience points for extinguishing development rights in that low elevation, high flood risk part of the city, which is called the Coastal Resilience Overlay. the way that they're earning these points for extinguishing development rights is essentially through the purchase of easements. And in the context of our project and in the zoning ordinance intent, conservation easements of a sort. So the program can do this for open parcels where there's no development, but development could occur, and that is certainly one option. But if the parcel is developed, the ordinance stipulates, residents have life rights to stay, but the structure must be removed in the event of death or moving, or if the structure is damaged 50% or more for any reason. So it could be fire, flood, wind, whatever, doesn't matter. Now, this is the floor standard in the ordinance. It can be more restrictive, and it's that more restrictive element that we're really interested in this project. So this is super interesting because the Resilient Quotient Program points is providing an option where they're incentivizing private sector investment to move people out of harm's way. So it's really a nice way to incentivize private transaction, infusing private capital to protect properties and protect people from flood risks. So it's a similar concept to a transfer of development rights program, but it's different because this option is really a removal of flood risk program, if you're going to think of it in existing planning contexts. There's the opportunity so our project goal is to figure out how this works. How does it work in practice, and how do we make the zoning ordinance, how do we adjust it, modify it, so it is actually reflective of the costs and the practicality of a developer electing this option and a landowner actually engaging in the program itself. So we got to figure out how it works in practice. Now this is a really, really fun graphic that shows how the transaction works and how we envision it working in practice. So if you want to follow along with me, I'm just going to do it quick and dirty. Let's say a developer wants to build or rebuild in high elevation, low risk area of the city. They have to meet resilient standards. So to meet the resilient standards, they elect the extinguishment of development rights option to earn the points needed. And they write a check for the desired points value, and that check goes to the land trust. In our example, it's a living river trust to finance the voluntary easements that are in the low and wet part of the city. The developer then gets the resilience points check, and the Living River Trust basically looks at a list, and they match the cost of transaction based on a list of people that have volunteered to participate in the program. And then the property owner that's selected based on the value of the resilience points and the amount of the check basically has two options. They can either be bought out and the structure is demoed right away, at which point they make a conservation donation of their parcel, which is now open to the land trust, deriving the financial benefits that come from that conservation donation, which in Virginia are state land conservation tax credits, which are saleable, 80 cents to the dollar. And then a conservation donation that is a federal, where they get a federal deduction that's based on their income value, and the land tax credits, which is the state option, is based on their property value. So that's option one. That one's easy. The second option is much more complicated, and that's where the property owner elects to stay in their structure and remain on the property, but they're still going to remove the development rights, and that's where we place an easement on the property, and then the easement does certain things that we'll get into later. So once a trigger point, whether it's that 50% damage or more, is reached in the easement, then we're calling that the trigger point. Then the structure must be demolished and a conservation donation is made, and all of the financial benefits are the same as the first example. So it's that trigger point in the rolling easement that we're really interested in exploring and developing. There are a lot of to-dos with this work, but the real big ones are, how does this work in practice? We're running 4 sample parcels through the transaction process, start to finish. We want to be sure that the resilience points are weighted correctly and are reflective of the actual transaction costs and the development community's appetite for this work. We want to make sure that we understand the financial benefits to property owners to make the conservation donation, to encumber their property when they decide to stay in their structure with a rolling easement that has the 50% or more trigger, or additional triggers like days of inundation during regular high tides, or days of inundation during lunar high tides, king tides. You know, the sky is somewhat limited, but you know, there are a lot of opportunities for what these trigger points could look like. Do developers really want to be in this program? We don't know. We haven't really spoken with them about it. And then finally, do we have a good template for rolling easements? And how do we develop trigger points that are attractive and palatable to landholders in Norfolk? We are also looking again at adaptive land management strategies to turn the abandoned neighborhood parcels from negative to positive, right? So abandoned parcels in a neighborhood doesn't sound so great in the face of sea level rise. How can we make it positive for the local government, for the community, for the land trust, so we can make this work an attractive solution rather than a negative burden? Okay, so we talked about how these working groups would pop up when they're related to what we're talking about. And so this is an example of the resilient zoning ordinance. It's going to talk about how this works in practice and are the points weighted correctly. The tax and valuation working group gets to all those financial benefits. What are the state tax credit implications? What are the federal deduction implications? What kind of incentive do we offer property owners that stay in their home and have a rolling easement encumbered? Do they get lower tax? Do this, because it's a hard concept to grasp. Rolling easement working group, that's pretty self-explanatory. We need to get a good template. And then finally, adaptive land management strategies. There will be some strategies that work in Chesapeake but don't work in Norfolk because or vice versa rather, because of the FEMA restrictions. And so we just want to be sure we're paying attention to those important nuances. So the pilot project deliverables for the City of Norfolk project are rolling easement template that's usable elsewhere in the country, a list that is FEMA that takes account the FEMA the strategies that may not work in the FEMA context, but would work in a private type program that doesn't involve FEMA. And then finally, a management plan for how land trusts can work with local incentive programs like this one to remove flood risk. We have these working groups that are essentially going to form the way that you, interested experts, can stay involved in these pilot projects. We encourage you to participate in these work groups. We will be doing all of the hard work down here in Virginia, but there will be times when we need your input and expertise to vet our progress and tell us our ideas are working or they're really not going to work in practice. We'll be providing you all with information and asking for feedback. So we want to, thank you in advance. Your participation is critical to ensure that the programs and policies that we're developing make sense and will actually work on the ground in your communities. So I'm going to briefly go through what each work group will do, noting that we're right at the 15-minute to the hour mark, and I want to be sure we have plenty of time for questions. Just want to note that we will always promise to be mindful of your time and make super efficient use of your meetings. And so you can see the timeline for each of these work groups is really just an estimate. We're not quite sure what the time, the work would entail, but we certainly wouldn't call a meeting unless it was really necessary. So the FEMA Acquisition Program Working Group, the goal is to develop a FEMA-approved deed restriction template. We want to be connected with the right people, identify issues, and then have you all review the document for whether or not it makes sense in specifically a land trust context. We want people who understand FEMA programs to be a part of this group. Rolling easement working groups. Rolling easements are one of the tools that are constantly talked about in the sea level rise adaptation community, but are not used in practice frequently or much at all. And so we really want to test this out in this pilot and make sure we're developing a template that will work. Tax and valuation. This is probably the most complicated and really one of the most critical parts of our work. We really want people to be engaged to understand the tax credit and federal deductions well. And then we also, really want people thinking about, helping us think about what we do to encourage property owners to want to participate in this program, specifically when they want to stay in their structure for life rights. The management strategies working group, this is somewhat self-explanatory, but if you've thought about what to do with abandoned parcels, we want to hear from you. The next two are projects, or excuse me, our working groups that are going to get kicked off later in the project time frame, and so we're looking at late 2020, early 2021, and that is because this work really hasn't come to the forefront yet. So the resilient zoning ordinance working group would come later once we know what the cost of all this works, and then the cost of all this is. And then finally, the last working group is community engagement. And we're just not ready to talk to the community yet. And this is most directed to the City of Chesapeake project, where we'll be meeting with their civic league and developing a plan for how to talk about these important issues. So very delicate work, and we're just not there in the project yet. Next steps, we're going to be following up via email that will have a recording of the webinar and then a survey for you to select the working group that you want to be a part of, or groups. And then we'll be having introductory webinars to begin, that will begin in early April to introduce these issues. So thank you for your participation and for sitting with us as we are talking at you right now. We really are grateful for your interest. So with that, I'm going to get my video going. And please unmute yourself. I think that I have to allow you all to unmute yourselves. Okay, everybody should be able to unmute yourselves as you are aware. So there's some questions in the chat box. So just a quick note, this webinar is being recorded and will be able to be reviewed by them, as we've been rushing through some of the last stuff here. And you can pass it along to others that you know might be interested that have missed it. It will be recorded as well. So, if you want to ask questions offline, happy to answer them via email. Okay, so I'm just going to go to the first question, which is from Carrie Hewlett. Question, what are the demographics of the neighborhood and surrounding Chesapeake parcel? Yeah, that's a really good question to be answered later. So demographics,
yeah.
John would know this better.
So that neighborhood in particular is largely kind of middle income. The house values are around $200,000 to $250,000. No one predominant race or ethnicity there. So the kind of demographics are kind of just middle income, middle class. A lot of people who purchase homes in that neighborhood purchase homes sight unseen. They're Navy folks moving from other states that haven't been here yet, and so they don't quite understand the flood risks. So that is kind of a factor in our community outreach.
Joy Depereaux asks, what exactly do the developers get with their resilient quotient points? They do not get tax credits, which is what she was asking. Do they get tax credits as an example? They receive the right to develop in the city. That's really it. That's all they get. They're basically, I think I had a nice way to think about this. The developer is paying the land trust to extinguish development rights, and in doing so earns the needed resilient quotient points in the ordinance to actually do development. So they're not getting any benefit other than the check to say they can do it.
Do they got density bonuses?
It's not a density bonus. It's just the right to develop at all. So they have to earn certain points based on what project they're trying to develop. And so the project they're trying to develop could be varied in size. So a large one would need more points and a small one would need less points.
I see. Thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem. Thanks, John.
Sure.
Parker asks, what is a rolling easement? So good question. A rolling easement is a legal construct like a conservation easement. It basically has provisions that require certain things to happen at certain times. It could either be a time metric or a alternative metric, which is what we're calling trigger points. So basically, easements can roll with the land or they can roll with time. And it basically would, the easement would say something like, at a certain point when, let's say, the coastline is encroaching on your property or your property is effectively on the coastline, you would need to remove your structure. The rolling component can work in lots of different ways and in lots of different point contexts. And so one of the things that we're working on in this project is trying to figure out all of the different ways a rolling easement can actually work in practice. But if you join the rolling easement work group, there'll be way more information about it and how it's worked currently in state, basically state code and state regulation is the way it's been most frequently used. Hallie, who's from the Eastern Shore Land Trust, Eastern Shore of Virginia Land Trust, how might this translate to a more rural area with similar high flood risk without the funding from developers? That's a great question. So for areas that are rural that will experience new growth, we see this as a particularly useful tool. For areas on the Eastern Shore where growth is not anticipated, specifically in the face of sea level rise, it will be a less attractive tool. And I don't have a good answer other than that now, but I think that we would like to talk about ways that it can be explored and how maybe rural communities could develop something different that would work for them. How is a rolling easement valued on a trigger point that is not known at the time of recordation? That's an excellent question. It is to be determined. That's why the valuation part of this is so interesting and so complicated. So we're talking about future values. Yeah, what's the future value of protection against future flood risk? We're not sure how to value that, and no one's valuing it from what we understand so far anywhere. And so we want to figure it out. So please be part of our valuation work group. What is the range of adaptive management options once the parcel is vacated? Their range, what is your intention with respect to perpetuation of the national network of thought leaders? Okay, so it's a lot of questions from Betsy. Thank you. Good to see you on. So the range of adaptive management options, the range is whatever the community will stomach and whatever provides a benefit. So we're not sure. We think that the range could be quite varied, from oyster restoration along the shoreline to nutrient credit trading, carbon sequestration credit trading. We really don't know.
It does have to fall within the confines of the FEMA deed.
For the FEMA project.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, but for the Norfolk project, it's more open.
Yep.
So that will be a nice difference that we'll be sure to be noting throughout. What's your intention? National network. So the intention is to become integrated through our working groups, and we'll be working with people that way. And then those people who are really active in our working groups, I imagine that they'll be a part of our symposium where they'll be, providing insight on, in a very concentrated way. Is this just this project, or you intend to continue? So we have a 3-year project, and do we think that it's going to go beyond the time frame? I would say our interest and retreat and instruments to incentivize it is timeless. We're going to be working in this space for a long time, I would bet. Elizabeth Andrews. Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth's provided a link to a clinical report from the Virginia Coastal Policy Center at William & Mary Law School. I'm a graduate of that program, and Elizabeth Andrews is the director of the program. So she has directed people to page 7 of this document that talks about rolling easements. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I think that that talks specifically about one of the state regulatory programs that I was referencing, the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Act, which is also adopted in Maryland in the Critical Areas Act, Critical Protection Areas Act. So there are some interesting policies in certain states that we'll be talking about in that rolling easement working group. Who pays for future expenses? This is from Parker again. Expenses that land trusts incur, such as real estate taxes and liability insurance. Great question.
So we have worked out a deal with the city of Chesapeake where they have devalued the assessed value of the parcels to nearly nothing. So we would have very little tax to worry about for those properties, like $5 a year or something like that. Liability insurance is something to consider for sure. I think for the Norfolk example, we'll hopefully be receiving, we will be receiving funds from a developer in which we would estimate the total transaction costs to conserve a piece of land, which would include real estate taxes and insurance as well.
Yep. Yeah, so it'll vary depending on which project we're talking about. Parker, so there have been questions about muting people, so I've just muted folks, so you have to unmute yourself when you ask questions after we go through all these questions. So thanks for all those notices. Parker is a 1998 grad of Bates College. Go Bobcats. Awesome. Go Bobcats. She said that to me privately, so I'm sure she's appreciating that I'm sharing that now. And Ducey Orts, from, okay, we got somebody calling or joining from Gloucester County, which is a community in North Carolina, in Virginia, excuse me, and says, what about operational costs for long-term maintenance? Okay, so Gloucester County, specifically where Ann is writing from, is they had an acquisition program similar to the city of Chesapeake's program, but they decided to abandon it because, not abandon it, but it's dormant right now because they did not feel like they had the expertise and the time to serve as kind of a real estate manager or like a land trust. And so operational costs are something that we're considering in, and I think John answered this a little bit, in the transaction costs. And for the Norfolk example, the developer will pay the cost in their fee up front for the resilience points that are earned. And for the Chesapeake example, we're working on ways to be creative about how to finance that. The idea is that some of the mitigation work that might happen, and hopefully will happen on the properties, could help fund sort of like a revolving loan fund to actually do future restoration and future buyouts,
Exactly.
to do even more work in this space in the future. What resilient nonprofits pay? Oh, got a dog freaking out. Nonprofits pay property taxes in Virginia. Yes, they do. What resilience plans does U.S. Navy have? We're not going to work with the Navy on this work as of right now. Maybe that will change in the future, but currently not in the purview of the work. Carrie, we will be sharing our slides. So she's mentioned that she will circulate them along the Climigration Network. Excellent. Climigration is a great group. I was just on one of their calls yesterday talking about retreat, and so we'd be interested in connecting with you on this work. Carrie, thanks. Another question from Edward Stoonbing. Conservation easements identify the contributing conservation values on a property. Okay, so we got a comment about valuation and land conservation. So I thank you for your comment, and definitely good to note. Please be a part of one of our working groups. Please show us the dog. Okay, Athena, come on in. Okay, that's the end of our questions that have been typed in. It's exactly 3 o'clock. If people have any additional questions that they want to share by unmuting your microphone, please feel free to do so and jump in. We'll stay for maybe 10, maybe, what do you think, 5-10 minutes after? Sure. And then if anybody wants to stay, please feel free to do so, and we'll cut off the webinar recording after we conclude the 10-minute time period. So anybody jump on in. And you just have to unmute yourself. I don't know if, hopefully folks are comfortable enough with the software to do that. Any questions?
Off the top, but under FEMA's CRS program, once a lot, let's say, is acquired or an easement is purchased from it, there are certain restoration activities that give a community more points under the CSR formula, which may or may not result in a lowering of flood insurance rates for, others that are in the community.
So, John, and you were cut off at the very beginning, but your comments about the CRS program, which, that's one of my areas of expertise. The CRS is one of the kind of credit generating activities that was mentioned as a adaptive land management strategy. That is one of the benefits that we will absolutely be including and talking about a great deal, just because it's a specific program of interest to our organization at Wetlands Watch, and the city of Chesapeake is in the CRS program, as is the city of Norfolk. And so those two communities would be able to, in these examples, receive credit under Activity 420, which is open space preservation for the open space that results after a demolition is occurring, but they would also receive credit for the acquisition action itself. So under different activity. And
then for certain restoration activities, once a parcel is cleared, and available.
Yes, and some of those small scale restoration activities are not credited, which is unfortunate. We've been working at the national level trying to change that.
Oh, good.
And maybe we would have some even more leverage if a project like this is successful, that we could explore that further. But yes, utilizing the CRS program is definitely part of the project.
Thank you.
Anyone else? We're having great comments on the people are excited and looking forward to engaging. John and I are going to be at the Land Trust Alliance Southeast Conference in Chattanooga next week.
I think so.
Or week after, yeah. And we'll be presenting on this work as well. And if you are there in person, we'd love to connect with you. We'll also be at the Virginia United Land Trust Conference in Harrisonburg in April. And I'll be speaking at a NOAA event at the end of this month on a plenary panel. So we're spreading the good word about this work, and hopefully it'll just grow the interest and the involvement, and everybody will benefit from the engagement, which is what our big hope is. Okay. Russell Jackson's on the CRS task force, and he's going to help push for any ideas for credit. So thanks, Russell. Really appreciate that. CRS task force is the national body that makes recommendations on how the CRS program changes policy-wise and credit-wise. So really important partner to this work. Okay, cool. Well, I think that's going to do it. So thanks everybody for being a part of this. Please look out for an email that will come from our organization, from Wetlands Watch, on with a webinar recording, as well as that survey that helps you select which working groups you want to be a part of. So thank you so much. It was great to see some of you here, and look forward to our working groups where we can talk a little bit more collaboratively and interactively rather than having us just talk at you, which is preferred for us.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Well, have a great afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much. Okay, we got all the minutes. Stop.
Maybe come home.
I don't like one.
It's tough. It makes the recording.
Stop.